Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our proceedings here at ASPI. I'm just going to start off with a couple of remarks, and then we're going to ask the author of the report to come and talk to us. And then we have a panel session for questions and answers. So I'm hoping that you all have your questions ready to go. And of course, at the end of the formal proceedings, we'll meet outside and we can continue the discussion in a less formal sense. So I'm also here joined by my colleagues from the Northern Territory Strategic Defence Advisory Board. We have our meeting tomorrow, in fact, so the timing has been just fabulous. And in particular, I'd also like to acknowledge the Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Business, Trade and Innovation, Sean Drept, who's here today as well with his staff. So hopefully you'll get time to talk with those guys. So back in 2018, the Northern Territory government refreshed its Defence and National Security strategy, and we released it at the ADM conference for those colleagues who were there and saw that. And it sets out the Territory's approach to the task of supporting our nation's defence and national security objectives through a number of things: a competitive industry, defence industry, a skilled, flexible workforce, a supportive community, and a responsive Territory government. Now, in terms of that strategy, we continue to work through that, and part of it is very much about developing strategic relationships, and particularly with the US, and we're delighted to have on our board Lieutenant General John Wissler, who will be part of the panel to provide that perspective. So I also would talk about the areas of focus, which I started to say was about strategic engagement and communication. We also have been focusing on business capability, workforce capability, the defence community writ large, so our families and also our veterans who reside up in the Territory, on innovation, research and partnerships, because that's also about moving the agenda forward. And of course, strategic infrastructure, which you may have seen some announcements about that in the last couple of weeks. So the Territory strategy recognises the role of the Territory within the dynamic Indo-Pacific region from a military, humanitarian, energy, border security and economic standpoint. So it's a very broad church. And some of the language we're starting to see now in the report is the ecosystem. So it's a much broader piece than just defence or national security. It's all of those things. Our strategy, we continue to work through that. Now, part of that was a recognition that we felt that the position of the North and its strategic importance, and we would contend increasing importance, hadn't been much of a focus. And we wanted to get that focus on the national agenda. So what better way to do that than work in partnership with ASPI and look at how they could do some research into this area so that we could start to put this whole issue about the North, the strength of the North, and how that impacts the strength of our defence and national security, and what needs to be done to forward that. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of points about why that program from the NT government's perspective is so important. It's about maintaining a strong public policy focus on the role of the North in the broader security of Australia. And at a time, I think we'd all agree, where strategic circumstances are driving new policy thinking in Canberra. Well, that's what we're trying to do here as well. It's also about developing a modernised way of thinking about the North and security, by updating strategic frameworks that remain anchored in the 1980s Defence of Australia context. And of course, if you've had time to read John's report, he makes some strong reference to that. It's about situating the North in a broader discussion about national security interests beyond defence, and encompassing such organisations as Home Affairs, Border and Customs, Space, Cyber, Biosecurity and Energy Security. So the ASPI research program is engaging with Australian government and international decision makers, industry decision makers and other strategic thinkers and influencers on the strategic importance and future development of the Northern Territory and its role in supporting defence, national security and industry. And of course, and you see the focus on much of the report and also some other reports that were released today. We're not talking about just the Northern Territory, although that's our focus, but we are talking about the north of Australia, which is far broader, as we know. And my colleague, where is he? Raden Gates is here, the Western Australian Defence Advocate. The NT wishes to maintain a strong public policy focus on the role of the North in the broader security of Australia at a time when strategic circumstances are driving new policy thinking, as I said. And we want to modernise the way of thinking as we move forward into solving the challenges of our current environment. So there's a number of points there. And you can see the strategic circumstances in the Indo-Pacific region have changed dramatically, and they're moving even faster and faster. So what was true of the environment 12 months, 2 years ago, is certainly very different today. The ASPI research program is ensuring that the critical role of the North in our nation's security is reflected in government and defence decisions at a time when North Australia's defence capabilities need to respond quickly to the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. And John will no doubt touch on some of those points in his words to you. And so we see a review of the 2016 Defence White Paper. Australia's force posture, or the Integrated Investment Plan, should be considering expediting some of the timelines on developing defence and defence support industry capabilities in the north of Australia. And certainly that's what we would like to have a discussion about. So without further ado, I'm going to invite John Coyne to the podium to address us as we launch his report. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Margaret. Welcome everyone to ASPI for this evening. And before starting again, I'd like to acknowledge the support and financial support of sponsorship from the Northern Territory Government in this program. But having said that, though, you know, I think it's always important to start whether or not you've got a personal connection or a bias to your research. And in my own case, I had the opportunity to deploy not once but twice through the city of Darwin to East Timor, the first time in 1999, the second time in 2000. And at the time, what struck me on both occasions was this, that if it weren't for the excess industry capability that was present in the Northern Territory at the time and the goodwill that came from the Territorians, much of what is achieved in 99 and 2000 in East Timor would not have been possible, to be very, very clear. So if anyone was sort of saying, well, about sponsorship or bias, that is my bias. I believe, having seen it firsthand, the importance of that sort of community relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, the strategic importance of Northern Australia to our national security has long been recognised by successive governments. But policymakers have struggled to develop a coherent long-term plan for what to actually do about our north. And I'm going to go back, now that I'm sort of an academic and I have my PhD, etc. for some time, I'm going to go through a bit of history because it is important, not for the sake of history's sake, but to see the comparisons and the parallels that the Northern Territory and the north of Australia has faced since even before Federation. In 1820, the British were obsessed with exercising their sovereignty over the island of Australia. They looked to their north to imperial activity by other colonising countries and wanted to surround, this should sound very familiar, surround the country with a ring of steel, a series of consecutive communities. So in 1824, they established Fort Dundas, which was on Melville Island. In 1827, they put 2 more forts on the Coburg Peninsula. In 1838, they put a further one, was established at Port Essendon. Life in these forts and communities was perilous and the mortality rates were extremely high. After no real investment in creating sustainable communities, and of course an improved security outlook, all were abandoned by 1850. Since Federation, Australian governments have periodically grappled with policy challenges in the north and how it ought to be defended in times of crisis. Most have been content that Northern Australia's expansive maritime approaches and long and mostly uninhabited coastline and landmass have historically made it difficult to both attack and defend. until then, by the late 1920s, Imperial Japan's ambitious plan to unite Asia had become increasingly obvious. But its burgeoning militarisation program needed greater access to primary natural resources to advance its strategy. On the 19th of September 1931, Japan's army invaded Manchuria for two reasons: ideology and natural resources. While the invasion sent shockwaves through the Australian government of the day, there was no intelligence failure. Australian diplomatic reporting had anticipated the move and well understood the Japanese Empire's assertive ambitions. At the time, Australia's government was understandably preoccupied with the economic challenges of the Great Depression. By 1932, the Australian government had become increasingly concerned about the possibility of Japanese aggression. In response, they quietly began preparing for the defence of Darwin, which included construction of logistics and defensive works, as well as the deployment of the Darwin Mobile Force. But Australia's economic woes of the day prevented and hampered policymakers' efforts. Just over 10 years later, at 1000 hours on the 19th of February 1942, the Japanese military attack on Darwin would again send shockwaves through the Australian government, but also across the country. In the first 40-minute raid, 188 planes launched from Japanese aircraft carriers in the Timor Sea, attacking shipping and civil and military infrastructure. An hour later, a second, shorter attack, utilising high-altitude bombers, targeted RAF base Parrop. In the months following the Darwin Raids, other Northern Australian towns were targeted. Now, the initial Darwin raid resulted in the loss of 11 vessels, critical to the Allies' resupply to Java and the Philippines, and all but severed surface ship resupply to Java. The damage to critical infrastructure and its impact on the civilian population significantly reduced Darwin's operational capacity for defence of Australia. And just as importantly, the attack dealt a grave psychological blow to the Australian government and people. The Japanese attacks on Darwin proved that Australia's defence plans for the North were woefully insufficient, despite the fact they had 10 years and 6 months grace from which to prepare for the eventuality. Until more recently, there hasn't been any real urgency of getting our defence thinking about Northern Australia right. During the Cold War, we're half a world away from the superpower competition. And ever since the release of Paul Dibb's 1986 review of defence capabilities, defence strategists have largely assumed that should the defence of North Australia ever become a national priority, we would have a decade or more to prepare for the problem. Unfortunately, and as Marg mentioned, Australia's strategic outlook has become more uncertain in a new era of great power competition. We now have to think about the defence of the North in a more deliberate and urgent fashion. Over the last decade, however, the gap between strategic policy vision outlined in successive defence white papers and the ADF's actual presence in the North has widened. Piecemeal defence investments in the North may have their benefits, but they don't provide a sufficient foundation for rapid military escalation should changing circumstances dictate. Because of the significantly reduced warning times for future conflict, it's likely that Northern Australia will increasingly be either the ADF's forward operating base, a lily pad, or alternatively a springboard for another location in the Indo-Pacific. If our industry and logistics bases across Northern Australia can't easily be scaled up in a crisis, the ADF may not be able to defend our northern approaches or conduct joint expeditionary operations in our neighbourhood at short notice. In my report, I argue that there's a need to rethink the importance of Northern Australia, defined as those areas of north of the 26 parallel south, as a single, scalable defence and national security ecosystem. Titled Forward Operating Base North, this network could be developed to deliver integrated support to current and future ADF and national security operations. Now, traditionally an FOB is a small, usually temporary base that provides tactical support in an operational theatre. In the context of my work, I've described FOB North and conceived the North of Australia and its defence infrastructure as being in a state of readiness to support a range of defence contingencies, of which we may have little or no advanced warning. Northern Australia's industrial and logistics base will need to be enhanced to be able to provide a permanent civilianised replenishment and depot repair capacity for defence assets deployed across the various physical nodes of FOB North. For Australia's future defence force, much of the thinking to date has been concerned with capability choices, manufacturing and deep maintenance. The next step must see in place the facilities and resources needed to sustain those capabilities in the north before their deployments. Darwin and RAF-based Tyndall would need to become critical nodes in global defence supply chains for such capabilities as the RAAF's F-35 jets. These preparations will also require federal, state and territory government investment in Industry 4.0 capacity in Northern Australia. To succeed, the FOB North concept must be a key element of Australia's broader national security strategy. ADF and other national security activities must be closely linked and mutually supporting with a forward operating base North strategy, and Home Affairs and intelligence agencies should also be integrated with it. Of course, as always, one of the biggest stumbling blocks in achieving such an endeavour is money. The creation of FOB North would require investment, though that shouldn't be simplistically viewed through a defence lens. Rather, the entire strategy should be based on a cost-sharing arrangement within a national investment plan across both the public and private sectors. The FOB North concept would provide policymakers with a foundation for thinking of the North as a facilitator of engagement with the region. FOB North will make the north of Australia a vehicle for regional defence and security rather than defence from the region. The development of FOB North needs to be part of and supported by Australia's sovereign nation-building efforts. As both a sovereign defence and a national security concept, FOB North would play an integral part in building national resilience in Northern Australia. It shouldn't simply be planned or delivered through a future defence white paper. This kind of ambitious national approach will involve defence working with a diverse array of stakeholders and partners. It will also allow defence to make a significant and lasting contribution to its most basic strategic interest, a secure and resilient Australia. The first steps involve defence needing to encourage and nurture further public policy discourse on the role of North Australia in defence and national security. Greater intellectual rigour, like that applied during World War II and by DIB in 1986, will then need to be translated into a shared vision of the role of the North in the defence of Australia and national security. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
So I'm joined by some esteemed colleagues who've talked about and researched and been part of this region. In fact, John's work in the US Marine Corps brought him to Australia, so welcome back. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions of each of these fellows, and then I'm going to invite you to ask your questions. So, John, can I start with you? Sorry, this is John. You've just spoken about the high points of your research and your report. So what do you think are the imperatives for the government taking that forward?
Look, I think in the first place, there's two things that need to be done. Number one is we need to challenge the current discourse and start really talking about the North and go beyond these traditional discussions of the North is important, and take that conversation to the North is important, why? So if FOB North isn't what is needed, we need to go through the discussion of what is. The second point, though, and this is something that is critical, is really what we have at the moment needs to be stress tested. There are a range of assumptions about the capacity of industry, the capacity of logistics and supply chains to support ongoing military operations from Australia's north. In this case, a lot of those I think are not well founded, and certainly there's some assumptions that have gone into that at the moment. There's pervasive rumours in relation to supply chains for fuel in long-term planned exercises. Those sorts of things need to be tested, and they need to be tested and stress tested in an open and transparent way.
Thank you. And John Wissler, I'll turn to you. Your vast experience in the Marine Corps and certainly operating in this area of operations, and now joining us to advise the Northern Territory Government in terms of the defence and national security. What are your observations so far about how we're addressing the strengthening in the north, if you like?
Thanks, Mark. I think the timeliness of this is really exceptional, and I say that because there have been a number of documents released on from the U.S. side, starting with Secretary Mattis's National Defense Strategy. A national defense strategy worked closely with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, who's a Marine. So that strategy reinforced in the June release of the U.S. Indo-PACOM strategic report. And then as recently as July, with the new Commandant of the Marine Corps in the United States, the Senior Marine released his Commandant's planning guidance. All three of those focus to the challenges of Asia, the Indo-PACOM theater, and the focus of this for the U.S. in terms of how to deal in a nation-state conflict. Each of those gets after a fundamental shift, if you will, from where the U.S. specifically, but I would offer many of the nations have been since 9/11 in the United States, which is focused on counterinsurgency around the world. The National Defense Strategy and all those documents have not said that we won't have to do any more fight against global terrorism. That certainly will continue, and we have to be able to do that, but we also have to be ready for this now nation-state conflict. The importance of that is to do nation-state conflict requires a level of logistics significantly more agile and sufficiently more resilient than anything we've had to do in Iraq, Afghanistan, or throughout the Middle East. And to be honest, anywhere else in the world where we've executed counterinsurgency operations. This report highlights an aspect of that resilience, of the need for those kinds of logistics, and the fact that the Northern Territories, by their geography, but also by their capability and capacity, is set up well for supporting that improved capabilities of logistics. The second piece of that, with the grand change in technologies today, weapon systems, new weapon systems, you mentioned the F-35, a fifth-generation aviation platform, but we're now getting into fifth-generation unmanned platforms, air, ground, and sea. We're getting into fifth-generation long-range precision ground-based fires capabilities. All those things require us to train in ways that we haven't been able to train previously, or certainly in Asia can't train the ways that at least U.S. and Australian forces and other partner nations and allies can train together in the Northern Territories. So if you put together those pieces of logistics and those pieces of training, this report highlights the need to be able to sustain both a modernized training environment, which will be not only helpful to the Australian Defence Force, but will be significantly helpful for all allies and partners. The one thing in my time as a Marine, I spent 39 years as a Marine, the one thing I came to the realization of at the end of that was that no country will ever fight independently for the rest in the future. We will all have allies and partners next to us. And in order to be successful in this modern battlefield, which is one that requires significant interoperability and a significant understanding and an ability to see the battle space the same, the opportunities afforded in the Northern Territories will be one of those things that will be leveraged, as I said, not only by the Australian Defence Forces, but by other U.S. forces and other allies and partners to get them there. The challenges will be the investment. That's always the challenge. But I think we have to start looking at that investment from the alternative. And as was stated, the pace of change is so significant from those adversaries that we face today that we can't postpone this discourse and discussion any longer and must get on with a solution.
Thank you. And Alan, I'll turn to you now. I don't know if you all saw his article in The Australian today that just happened to be at the same time as the launch of the report. So honestly, that's true. Alan, you raised some very interesting points about things like resilience, particularly around, for example, you cited the issue around fuel. But can you share with us some of your observations as you've looked at this issue about strengthening the North and the importance of the North?
Yes, thanks, Mark. Well, look, I'd like to pick up on a few of the points that John made earlier on that I don't think we've probably grasped adequately, all of us collectively, about what we're actually talking about when we mention defence and national security. So John's sort of the great virtue of his report is that it sort of forced me to reconceptualise myself what I was thinking about in terms of defence. So over the last 30 or 40 years, we've had this sort of debate in Australia about how we defend the continent of Australia. It's a kind of fixed way of thinking about defence versus whether we deploy forward, the Forward Australia policy, do we have expeditionary forces? And I think that's a very linear way of thinking about defence and national security for a couple of reasons. So the first thing is you've got to be able to walk and chew gum together. So it's not a choice between defending the continent of Australia in a Maginot Line sense or having capacity to deploy forces further afield in defence of our interests and protection of our interests. You've got to be able to do both. Secondly, it's not just about conventional military threats, it's about a whole range of security challenges right across the national security spectrum. Everything from people smuggling, organised crime down one end of the spectrum, up to cyber attacks, all these sorts of new security challenges. So we haven't actually thought as a country about how we holistically deal with these challenges, what sort of capabilities we need. And I think John's key point is we need to have capacity in the country, and particularly in Northern Australia, where we're going to have to confront a lot of these challenges, that is a full spectrum defence and national security strategy and capabilities that are scalable and smart in terms of the use of technology, right? So that's quite a different way of thinking about defence of the North compared with the debates we had in the 1980s and certainly even back in the Second World War. So I think that's the first big point I wanted to make. And secondly, you can be cynical about this and say, well, this is the Northern Territory just trying to get a little piece of the defence pie. But I think a serious look at that would suggest that whatever way you look at it, Northern Australia has to be critical in anything we do in the future across that whole national security spectrum. Whether it's defending the continent of Australia, which I think is hopefully unlikely, but it's still possible, to being able to deploy forces, the Australian ADF from Australia forward, as well as working with allies, you need to have what John calls the Forward Operating Base North, which joins up the whole of Northern Australia and its capabilities to provide a launching pad for our forces, whether it's everything from emergency evacuations right through to search and rescue to the high-end warfighting stuff. So that was the big takeaway for me reading that report. So if you haven't read it, I think it's written in a very accessible way. You don't have to be a military expert or a military junkie to read and appreciate it. I think it's a sort of report that anyone is interested in about these issues, and I think that should be all of us, should be able to read that report and take something away from it. So I just wanted to say well done, John, and well done, ASPI, in doing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always wise to jump in first, I find, in these things. So as I think back to the 1980s, what I think is really interesting about that is how our thinking about Indonesia has changed over that period of time. So when Paul Dibb was doing his review, we were in the defence establishment candidly worried about the risk of low-level incursions from Indonesia, maybe Indonesian special forces coming down south to Australia, wreaking havoc in remote communities, that type of thing. We had a Timor which was very much incorporated into the Indonesian Republic. And we had a very close defence relationship with Papua New Guinea, which I think really looked to Australia for its security. you fast forward to where we're at now, and it seems to me everything's changed. We now look at Indonesia more as a potential partner that we could be working with in dealing with broader regional security threats. We have Timor, which is independent, and we have a Papua New Guinea, which has grown considerably and has developed relations with a whole range of countries outside of the Australian context. Somewhat weakening, perhaps, although I think we're trying to bring it back, the nature of our defence relationship. I want to put it to the three panellists that this is a vastly different world in which to think about the North and our interests now. And could I ask you to sort of say a little bit about those three countries and what a reconceptualised defence of the North strategy might mean for the things that we can do with those partners in our region?
Look, I might kick it off. I think in general terms, I think there's a range of defence opportunities here, or a range of opportunities to work with those countries. But first and foremost, in planning for the worst case scenario, I very much see, if we're looking at this in terms of a wider, theatre level conflict, I think that we automatically, the north of Australia becomes and in old speak, military speak, it becomes the A echelon for supporting defence activities in those countries that are done in partnership. I think more broadly though, and in the interim, there's a range of activities that are well truly open to us right now. At the very start of it is, I raised this late last year, which is there's a really great opportunity. Coast Guards across this region have never been more important, in terms of the rule of law, never been more important in terms of counter-terrorism across the region. And there's a really good opportunity to centre the North Australia and establish a regional academy for Coast Guards out of Australia's north that allows us to build the sort of long-term relationships that have been achieved in centres like JCLEC, which is the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, in terms of law enforcement, and what's been done for decades by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the Royal Military College Dundroon. And certainly, for those who seek that sort of evidence in history, we only have to look at we only have to look at Motane on the East and West Timor in 1999 and look at the efforts that were made by two officers who had spent time together in ADFA and were able to use that relationship. So from my perspective, I think there's a whole range of activities of building those sorts of relationships of trust.
Thanks, John. John, do you have
Nothing specific, but I would like to make a comment. I think those three countries that you spoke of are a good example of a number of places around the world that have the potential to be influenced by China or Russia and the malign influences. In the Commandant's Planning Guidance, General Berger mentions his two priorities are to firmly address the One Belt, One Road concept that the Chinese have. And those countries could potentially be susceptible to sort of malign intervention along the guise, and I say guise, along that sort of idea of One Belt, One Road. And so I think building those partnerships prevents negative outcomes from the One Belt, One Road. His other focus is on defeating malign influences in the South and South China Seas. And so, once again, having partners throughout that region who border on those regions, building those partnerships make it critical. The challenge for building those partnerships throughout all of Asia is how do you have a sustainable logistics base to be able to do that and to flow in and out of those easily? And I think those issues were well addressed by John in the report. And so I think that highlights the fact that in this time of nation-state conflict, when the idea is to succeed in the area below armed conflict, to put off, as Alan said, sort of the idea that we're going to be in this high-end fight, but to actually win before the high-end fight occurs, is going to demand that we be successful in places like Indonesia and in Timor and in Papua New Guinea.
Thanks. Alan, do you have a...
Yeah, look, I think first thing I'd say in response to your question, Peter, is that the single most important thing that's changed since the 1980s is that for 75 years, the West, if you like, broadly defined, including us, essentially controlled most of the Pacific through our economic, financial and our strategic power. So it was an uncontested region. So if you look at today, that is not the case. I mean, so let's talk about China, or whatever your views are on China. There's no question that for the first time in our modern history, Australia confronts a rising, powerful China that has economic and financial power, unlike the Soviet Union, as well as military power. So that's the framing of my response to your answer about those three countries. So in that context, it's much more challenging for us to get other countries to do what we want them to do, okay, and to shape them, because they've got choices and they've also got pressures on them, similar to the ones we confront. So on the one hand, China is an important trading partner for all these countries, especially for Indonesia and increasingly Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste now. China's become important for them. They have a lot of weight. So it's going to challenge our foreign and national security policies in ways we haven't been challenged before. You can't just tell other countries what to do. It's not about us giving them aid anymore. It's about us working in partnership with them on common interests, but accepting that there are some times we are not going to get what we want out of that, and we have to accept that, and we have to be responsive to the things they want too. So, for example, in this little debate about climate change in the Pacific Island countries, you know, my argument has been, whatever the Australian government might think about climate change, the reality is that this is an important issue for small Pacific Island states. So if we expect them to come on board our strategic views about what needs to be done, we've got to give something in return. Same with Papua New Guinea. You know, they say that China is providing them a lot of aid and support for much needed infrastructure development, and why should they have all their eggs in the Australian basket? That's a fair point. So we're going to have to be much more subtle and clever about our policy mixes, and we need to have a joined up policy, because countries like China are joined up naturally. So if we have sort of siloed policies and episodic approaches, you know, foreign affairs as a foreign policy, defence as a defence policy, but none of that's joined up, we are going to lose out. And it is a competition. I don't want you to think I'm talking up the China threat, I'm not, but it is a competition for power and the ability to shape the region and to set the rules. And small countries like Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste are very susceptible to that because they don't have a lot of money and resources. So if I was in East Timor, I'd be looking at the Chinese too to see what they can offer. So that's the context in which we've got to devise much smarter, more nuanced policies that are very specific to those countries and not just a kind of Asia one-size-fits-all policy. That would be disastrous in my view.
Thanks, Alan.